he's a monster and eats people, and it's like a whole thing. Hi, my name is Adriana, and today I will be reviewing Ariadne by Jennifer Saint. So, like most middle schoolers in the late noughties, I was obsessed with Greek mythology, and that has somewhat transitioned into my adulthood with just loving Greek mythology retellings. I absolutely adored the Percy Jackson series. I'm currently rereading it. I loved both The Song of Achilles and Circe. I loved Lovely War. Like, anything that has to do with Greek mythology, I'm probably gonna be into it. I'm probably gonna enjoy it. So when I saw this book floating around, I think it was one of the Book of the Month picks and everything else, I was very intrigued. This is a story you don't get to see retold very often. It's not as romantic as like a Hades and Persephone or a Helen of Troy. I mean, those stories have been retold over and over again ad nauseum. The story of Theseus and the Minotaur and Ariadne is not one you see around very often, and especially from Ariadne's point of view. I went into this without, rereading any of the original myth. I still knew most of the story. King Minos? I don't know. The king requires 7 sons and daughters of Athens to be sacrificed to Crete every year or every 7 years, depending on the myth you're looking at. They get released into the labyrinth with the Minotaur and end up getting eaten by the Minotaur every year. And I guess for those, if you're totally unfamiliar with Greek mythology, the Minotaur is a half man, half bull. He's bull from the waist up and a man from the waist down. And he's a monster and eats people, and it's like a whole thing. And when Theseus is a part of the Sons and Daughters of Athens, he comes over and Ariadne falls in love with him and wants to save him and the other Athenians. So she goes to the man who built the labyrinth, Daedalus, and he gives her this ball of enchanted in some retellings, and this retelling is just a ball of twine to help Theseus find his way back to the front of the maze after defeating the Minotaur. And so that's how Ariadne helps them escape. They escape together with all the other Athenians, and they stop at this island called Naxos, and Theseus ends up abandoning her there. So the myth telling that I grew up with comes from this book, Dolores' Book of Greek Myths. It's definitely more geared towards children. So I believe in this retelling, let me see if I can find it. So in this retelling, when they arrive to the island of Naxos, Dionysus comes to Theseus and says, hey, you gotta leave Ariadne here. I want her. You gotta cut her loose and get out. And because of his grief at having to leave Ariadne, he leaves up the black sails that signal to the kingdom that the Athenians did not make it back from the island of Crete. And in seeing that, Theseus, his father, flings himself off the cliff and kills himself. So that's kind of the original kind of general telling. I think in most retellings they just kind of say, yeah, Theseus abandoned her, and don't really go into the why, or if he's just a giant dick, or like what the whole reasoning is. But as far as Ariadne is concerned, she saves this Athenian dude. They escape Crete together on a boat. They go to an island and she gets left there and marries Dionysus, the god of wine. So obviously there's a bit more in this book. That's only the first part. There are, I think, 5 parts in total. And the interesting thing about this book is that it ties together a bunch of different versions of this Ariadne of Naxos mythology, which there's a lot more to it than I ever realized. So what I just described is basically the whole first part of the book, but it also includes her little sister Phaedra, who also helps Theseus escape, but doesn't end up leaving Crete with him. He ends up abandoning her on the shore and lies to Ariadne about having abandoned her. So if you can't quite tell from just that little snippet there, none of the men in this book are really good guys. I think the general themes of this book is just how poorly women are treated in these Greek mythology stories, Greek myths. The prologue is actually about Ariadne's father, the King Minos. He, in his kind of conquering of neighboring countries, comes up to kind of a similar situation as Theseus, where one of his missions is aided by the daughter of a king that he is trying to take over or kill or something, and that woman's name is Scylla, so she helps him defeat, betraying her own family, and Minos escapes the situation with her, but ends up tying her to the back of the boat and drowning her by carrying her back that way because she had dishonored herself and her family by betraying them, even though she helped. King Minos wouldn't have been able to do what he did without her, so that's obviously not great. Obviously they're immediately drawing a parallel between Scylla and Ariadne, and this book is littered with references to many other Greek myths. If you're not well versed, I mean, even me as someone who's like moderately well versed in Greek mythology, it was a little jarring to see so many references like all throughout it. I made a couple notes in here about it, just peppered in everywhere. So I think that's probably just, this is the debut novel of Jennifer Saint, so I feel like that kind of stuff will kind of work its way out as she does more published writing, but it does feel a little abrupt every time you run into these like cameos from other Greek myths, but they all do kind of aid in this overall theme of women get treated like trash in the Greek mythology. So to get started in my more kind of structured review, I'd like to start with characters. We have two point of view characters and then kind of four main players in the game. So our 2 point of view characters are Ariadne and her little sister Phaedra. And Ariadne is very, very feminine. She's very sweet, she's very soft-spoken, she's very feminine. Like, I think kind of the ideal Greek woman is what she's out here to represent, which I think makes a lot of sense for this character specifically. I was reading through after I finished this book, I was reading through my mythology textbook from an elective I took in college, and there is kind of a belief that Ariadne might have been originally like a Cretan goddess, so like a goddess of the island of Crete, and was kind of woven into the larger Greek mythos through this Theseus myth. So it makes sense that she's kind of an Aphrodite type character, just a perfect woman. Come on, get up! Just kind of a perfect womanly Greek woman. Her little sister, on the other hand, is a lot more, she's kind of a foil. She's spunky, she's cunning, she's really sharp. Both of these sisters end up falling hard for Theseus at the beginning of the book. He's this typical Greek demigod hero. He's chiseled, he's handsome, he's brave, he's strong. So, of course, they both fall in love with him. He ends up kind of, I think the entire time he's actually a giant dick, but at first he's presented as a true Greek hero, but that facade fades very, very quickly. And then the fourth character we get to kind of delve into is Dionysus. I alluded to him earlier. He is the Greek god of wine and parties, essentially. So when I obviously knew that Dionysus was going to be a part of this story, something I really appreciate that the author did was incorporate this religion known as the cult of Dionysus. It was an ancient Greek religion that followed the god Dionysus, and it was almost exclusively patroned by women, and it was basically an excuse for women to, you know, take their veil off, let their hair down, and just fucking rage, just party. So I think it was really cool to be able to see that integrated into this kind of classical story, and it does play a rather large part, because we do spend a large portion of the book with Ariadne and Dionysus on the island of Naxos, and being able to characterize a god, especially like a Greek god, is something you don't see in a lot of these Greek retellings. They're mostly just kind of portrayed as they are within the mythology itself, where they're kind of a one-dimensional like character, like they're just the god of whatever they are, and they're almighty and powerful and kind of shitty. Like, so you really don't get to see them characterized as much, but I think the author did a really good job of characterizing Dionysus and kind of diving into his psyche a little bit. So I thought that was really neat. I really appreciated that about this book. Next, moving on to plot. I think this book has 5 parts, and they do feel somewhat disjointed, but I think it's understandable because this author is trying to weave together many different retellings of this myth. She uses parts of Homer's retelling, part of Ovid's retelling, part of just kind of the general myth that you see reprinted in a lot of mythology books. So I thought that part was somewhat understandable, but each part does feel kind of like its own isolated story, which does kind of make you start and stop, and especially the final part of the book I felt was really, really rushed. Next, I would like to talk about setting and atmosphere. I think this is where this author really shined with this book. I think everything is described in such beautiful detail. We start part 1 in the palace of Crete, and she talks about the incredible luxury of this palace and the marble floors and the columns and the everything else, the way they live their life, and it's just really cool to see that. And then the second part takes place mostly on the island of Naxos, where Ariadne was abandoned by Theseus and married Dionysus. And this is basically just cottagecore porn. Like, everything about it is, you know, she's cultivating her own grapes and food, and she's living outside basically, but still has this beautiful small home and everything else. So it's just kind of fun there. We get a little bit of Athens because Phaedra, the sister, ends up being married off to Theseus after some political shenanigans. So we get a little bit of Athens, and I think there is a good distinction between Crete and Athens that is drawn. Crete is a much wealthier kingdom at this time than Athens was, and you get a good kind of idea of that through the story and the world building. And those are kind of our three main settings, and all of them have their own distinct atmosphere, which I think is really neat too. So overall, I did really enjoy this book. I don't know if I can quite give it a 5-star. I think the writing itself, like I said, a little disjointed, a little iffy here and there. I think while I do appreciate that the author I can obviously tell the author put a lot of research into this book and into this myth and all the different tellings by many different authors over the century/millennia. So I do really appreciate that, but it just wasn't quite there. But I do highly recommend it if you are interested in Greek mythology. I think if you're not interested in Greek mythology, you might not enjoy this so much, just because it does rely so heavily on your knowing who characters like Heracles and Perseus and kind of the Greek pantheon of gods as a whole. Maybe take my recommendation with a grain of salt if you're not a Greek mythology super fan like a lot of us out there are. But I did really enjoy this book, and I am very glad I read it. So thanks so much for watching, and I will catch you on the next video.